Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, I guess, since we're a minute past noon. Welcome. My name is Gabe Scheinman. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. It's so great to see so many students filing in, so many alumni, faculty, supporters of AHS. It's really great to have you all joining today. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, the Alexander Hamilton Society is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization that seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and young women into the foreign policy and national security world, imbued with the Hamiltonian perspective of strong and principled American leadership in global affairs. We operate first and foremost on college campuses across the country, where our student-led chapters host some of our nation's most eminent scholars and practitioners, including some of those here in this event with us on campus, for debates with some of their local faculty on some of the biggest issues facing the United States and the world today. Our over 50 chapters host nearly 200 events a year on campuses, and our nearly 1,000 alumni are serving across the national security and foreign policy space. So if you're interested in learning a bit more about us or would like to get involved with our work, please visit alexanderhamiltonsociety.org, and we'd love to connect with you. Today is a very special day for us as we get to do multiple great things at once. We get to convene a phenomenal panel with some of our nation's leading thinkers and doers on what US-China strategy and policy ought to be. We get to actually promote a book, which is actually a rare thing these days for a whole bunch of reasons. And finally, we get to celebrate one of our own. My friend and partner in crime, Dan Blumenthal, whose book, which I have here, The China Nightmare, The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State, which you're here to discuss, is one of the co-founders of the Alexander Hamilton Society. And so in many ways, this is a celebration of accomplishment of one of our own. While his night job may be as an AHS co-founder and leader, Dan's day job is as a resident fellow and director of Asian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on East Asian security issues and Sino-American relations. Joining us to discuss Dan's book is another leader in setting US-China policy, Matt Pottinger. Mr. Pottinger is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. He served the White House for 4 years in senior roles on the National Security Council staff, including as Deputy National Security Advisor from 2019 until earlier this year. In that role, he coordinated the full spectrum of national security policy. And prior to that, he served as the Senior Director for Asia, where he led the administration's work on the Indo-Pacific region, and in particular, its shift on China policy. Before his White House service, he spent the late 1990s and early 2000s in China as a reporter, and then fought in Iraq and Afghanistan as a US Marine during several combat deployments a little over a decade ago. Finally, I'm also truly pleased to introduce our moderator, my friend, Dr. Nadia Schadlow. Dr. Schadlow is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and also a member of the AHS Board of Advisors. She was most recently US Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy. And prior to joining the National Security Council, she served as a senior program officer in the International Security and Foreign Policy Program of the Smith-Richardson Foundation, where she helped identify strategic issues which warrant further attention between the US policy community. Between Dan, Matt, and Nadia, I really cannot think of a more distinguished and insightful trio to lead us in discussion of what in many ways is literally the most critical question facing the United States' role in the world today. And before I disappear and hand it off to Nadia to moderate the conversation, we'll have about 25, 30 minutes at the end for all of you to actually ask questions. And to do that, please submit your questions in writing through the Q&A function in the dashboard at the bottom. And when we turn to that section, I will reappear and call on you and figuratively hand over the mic to you, i.e. unmute you for you to ask your question live. And so with that, I will disappear, and Nadia, the Zoom is yours.
Great, thanks so much, Gabe. It's really a delight to be here this afternoon with Matt and Dan, two old friends. And I'm a big fan, as you know, of the Alexander Hamilton Society, and I've had the privilege of meeting so many of the students, and I always really enjoy those interactions. So I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion today because Dan's book offers a provocative thesis, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Matt's views on it. We'll structure the discussion around Dan's book, as Gabe said. I think this is upside down for someone, I'm not sure, but The China Nightmare. But what's really interesting about the book is its subtitle, which is The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State. So Dan's fundamental argument is that China has more internal weaknesses than are generally assumed in many of today's China's discussions. He argues that China, some of these weaknesses include President Xi's reversal of his predecessor's political and economic reforms, a looming demographic crisis, an anti-corruption campaign which has produced disgruntled elites, Fundamentally, he argues that China under President Xi has turned into a national security state that will result in lower rates of economic growth. I like the book because it has lots of facts. So for instance, one that struck me was that China has the largest state sector in the world today with over 150,000 state-owned enterprises. And interestingly, this sector receives over 80% of the bank loans in China, with China's private sector receiving some 11%. So I like those statistics because they sort of really show the imbalance. Dan argues that these weaknesses are here and they're likely to lead to more aggressive or external assertiveness by China and a determination to create a world order that's favorable to the CCP's interests. After Dan actually highlights some of these points himself in his own words, I'd then like to turn to Matt, and I'd really like to hear about how Matt, the degree to which Matt, while he's sitting on the National Security Council, how he saw some of these weaknesses play out. If he agrees with Dan's thesis, right, he might not. So I'd like to hear more about what Matt's views are on these weaknesses and the degree to which they impact China's long-term trajectory. So I think this will be an interesting discussion. I'll turn to Dan now and then Matt. Thanks. You're on, Dan. I'll go on mute.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nadia. I'm thrilled to be with you and with Matt and with AHS. I mean, Nadia and Matt really are so instrumental in shifting our China policy, what I believe is the right direction under such very difficult circumstances in American and international politics. So it's just really a thrill to be with the two of you today to discuss my thesis on the book. So Nadia captured the thesis in her usually very articulate way. The book goes through China's ambitions, which are extremely broad and deep, and it's to reorder the international system. It has been for some time to favor the CCP's authoritarian rule. It's been doing so, as we have seen, and as Matt and others have lived through international organizations, through its military buildup, its coercive campaigns inside the Indo-Pacific region, the military and technological prowess it has built up, the diplomatic presence it has built up, and I think that story is getting fairly well known. I won't say I won't say it was a very well known story until 4 or 5 years ago, but certainly it's been building up that power and had those ambitions to contest the United States for international leadership in so many different dimensions of power for as long as I've been looking, over 20 years, 21 years. But what's less known, and what I also wanted to bring out, is these weaknesses that Nadia mentioned. And part of the reversal, the big reversal of economic and even some political reform, there was some political reform, began not under Xi Jinping. It began under his predecessor, Hu Jintao, who, as I argue in the book, couldn't withstand the onslaught of political pressures after China entered the World Trade Organization. Political pressures that were building up when Deng Xiaoping started to reform the Chinese economy. It had been building up for years. And so it was actually Hu Jintao and then the world financial crisis. Again, something that Westerners really missed. It was the international financial crisis where we were supposedly doing everything wrong and China was doing everything right, where, as Nadia mentioned, the state sector came roaring back in. The amount of debt accumulated by China because of these bad loans to the state sector, as Nadia mentioned, the amount of private entrepreneurship that was squashed, and so forth. So it's really been since about 2008, 2009, since the reversal of these economic reforms and the collection of these masses of debt and other risks to the economy and to the political system. And of course, a crisis, as I write about, a near political crisis in 2012, in which Xi Jinping's leadership was contested by Bo Xilai, another charismatic son of a long marcher, a Mao lieutenant. So a lot of problems have accumulated. Now, to the point that that has not stopped China from acting aggressively with its newfound power. And I think the tagline that has most resonated is that it is this strong and ambitious, but increasingly frustrated power that poses a special kind of danger to the world. And I think we've seen that as I sum up my initial points in the last year or two, if not more. But we've seen that during COVID-19, it wasn't that China was suffering and therefore looking inward to solve its own problems. It lashed out. It lashed out in the Taiwan Strait. It lashed out in the South China Sea. It lashed out against the Indians. It lashed out against us in this so-called wolf warrior diplomacy and disinformation campaigns. Its campaigns against Australia. So a Xi Jinping who is more centralized, more powerful inside of China, but faces a constant need to conduct these internal purges, to look out for dissent, to create this and perfect this authoritarian surveillance regime, is not a Xi Jinping that rests quietly. It's a Xi Jinping that sees more of a need to gain some nationalistic wins. We've also seen that in his march through Hong Kong last year. So the main argument, I think, for policymakers and for students is that we're entering a time of extreme danger with China, where it has enough power to cause serious damage, but doesn't think necessarily that time is on its side because of all the frustrations that my book talks about and Nadia detailed as well. So let me stop there in terms of my opening remarks and see what Matt has to say.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Yeah, Matt, so I'd really like to hear, do you agree with Dan's fundamental thesis? Is he overstating China's weaknesses? And then third, I'd like you to address, if possible, do the weaknesses matter? In that, is China so far ahead in key domains like 5G and kind of its key areas of technology where it already has kind of the high ground in a way, and its weaknesses aren't going to matter as much because it can use the advantages it has. So I'd like to hear your thoughts, Matt. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nadia. Gabe, thanks. And Dan, congrats on writing a great book. I think that the thesis is strong and consistent with a great deal of what I witnessed over the course of my 4 years in the White House. So big congrats. It's also well written. It's written tight and short, which is a sign of a very disciplined book. And I think it's great. You didn't have other verbiage to spare. Dan's points about the weaknesses, I think, are very much spot on as well. The vulnerabilities of the system. You don't build a national security state because it's good for business, right? You do it in spite of the fact that it's very bad for business because the party lacks other forms of credibility and legitimacy with its people. So I think that we've seen the state-owned enterprises perform worse over time, not better. What's really changed under Xi is that now the private sector is getting dragged down as well as the priorities of the party trump everything. Politics trumps business now in a way that I don't think would have been as easy to argue under the period of certainly Jiang Zemin in the 90s and even into the early period post WTO entry after 2001. So military civil fusion, this grand policy that basically subordinates every institution, every individual, every company, whether it's private or foreign, civilian or military, foreign or domestic, subordinates them all to the purpose of modernizing China's military and keeping the party in power. These are not signs of economic health, and these are things that in the short term are going to allow the party in this moment of centralized action to marshal a great deal of resources towards a few discrete aims. But over time, the shortcomings, the cracks that are going to appear and widen as a result of these policies are going to be very, very difficult for China to overcome. And I think Dan's point is right, that the party knows this. And it's why we're in this moment of danger that Dan describes. The party wants to achieve as many aims as it can internationally, globally, to try to lock in influence before all of the drawbacks of their economic model catch up to them with a vengeance. So we're in this tight window period now, and I think that the Chinese leadership is most acutely aware of this thing that we don't look enough at it in the West, but which Dan has pointed to as a central thesis. The idea also, Dan writes about China, it's provocative, is not an innovation nation. And this is a very provocative idea. You know, I think that without any question, Chinese people are as innovative, and in fact, more innovative than a lot of other countries' people. But the system that's in place does not reward the kind of innovation that China has the potential to achieve. And I think that there are pockets of excellence. There are things that we really need to look out for, whether it was on 5G or whether it's in the semiconductor space, biotech and genetic research. These are areas where China is putting all of its chips into these areas in ways that do require a defensive and coordinated counter strategy by the West, but one that has to try to preserve free market economics for those countries that are willing to play by those rules, that actually have the rule of law, while taking something more approximating industrial policy for dealing with trade and investment relationships with China. But I think Dan is right that again, Beijing itself does not believe, the leadership in China does not have the confidence that China will be able to stand on its own two legs in the innovation realm. We know that they were, you can see it just in their policies, how concerned they were about the idea of decoupling on the technological space. They're still highly dependent upon Western technology, Western laboratory access, and research lab access, and of course, intellectual property gained through any means necessary, whether it's forced technology transfer or just outright theft through cyber and human spying operations. But I think Dan is onto something that Beijing right now would not be able to have a self-perpetuating innovation economy without that relationship where they're siphoning intellectual property.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so you asked whether it matters, right?
Right.
Yeah,
does it matter? Yeah.
All of these, this knowledge of all these vulnerabilities are there for us to examine and make use of in ways that would allow us to put asymmetric pressure on Beijing and essentially to attack its international strategy, because the international strategy is one that is quite dangerous to democracy worldwide, certainly to our own democracy here in the United States. So the biggest vulnerability of all is China's number one adversary, and China's number one adversary is its own people. The Chinese Communist Party fears more than anyone or anything on earth its own people and the capacity of its own people to demand more effective and responsive governance. And so you can see that in any metric you look at. China spends more money on its internal security apparatus than it even spends on the PLA, which they're funding to the tune of massive increases year by year. It's the second most well-funded military in the world, and still that is outpaced by the amount of money that they're putting into internal repression. The fact that you have, and I saw that there was a report today by a group that had done a very systematic study of the Genocide Convention and found that China is in violation of every single term of that convention. You don't do that because that's good for business. You do that because you're terrified of your own people. You don't crush Hong Kong, which was the goose that was laying golden egg after golden egg for China. It was the main route through which investment poured into China. And they have needlessly crushed the autonomy and the rule of law and the credibility of one country, two systems as a model. I think that the problems that will come back to bite China as a result of its destruction of Hong Kong is the goose that lays the golden eggs. Again, not good for business. You don't do that unless you are terrified of your own people. And so that's very useful for people to keep in mind always, both Chinese people themselves and also foreign governments like our own that are trying to brush back China from trying to attain its most malign ambitions.
Thanks, Matt. I'd like you to comment, Dan. I just want to clarify one point. I, of course, think it matters. My point was more just so that I don't get excoriated, was that if China's, if it's so far ahead in 5G and some of the key technological platforms, that it can sort of dominance in those platforms can overcome some of its weaknesses. So that's my point, just for clarification.
No, your point, I understood it.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. What we find though, I mean, the experience of the Trump administration just finally pushing back against what China had presented as and nearly achieved as a fait accompli of domination of foreign 5G networks around the world. We found that actually that was sort of, it was a lot more hollow of a claim than Beijing cared to ever admit. And once we made the case to other governments around the world that Beijing's strategy was not to gain market share for the sake of business gains, but to gain market share into 5G networks for the sake of siphoning data, the lifeblood of the 21st century economy. I mean, the whole goal and the reason that China funded and subsidized Huawei to the tune of 120 billion, I think, was what one survey found, about 120 billion dollars in subsidies, not including all the intellectual property that they had acquired through various means. What they're really after is the data, and the sensitive individual data, the data of companies, the data of governments, intellectual property, and with a couple of steps in the form of export controls on cutting-edge American semiconductor technology, we've put Huawei into a real bind, and also created space again for the market to reassert itself and for businesses in free and open societies to start investing again in the equipment sector, not just in the software sector, where we're already miles ahead of China in 5G software. It's really just in the hardware piece, where all of the former companies that used to be in this space were all put out of business through the massive price dumping and subsidies of China's technological champions.
Thanks, Matt. So Dan, do you want to make some, offer some thoughts based on Matt's comments? And then maybe also gearing towards sort of how the Biden administration, reading your book, what would you like them to take away from it as they craft their China policy?
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, so Nadia, I think your question is a very, is extremely on point. So here's my take on, I made the provocative claim in the book and argued based on some data why it's not an innovative nation in the way we would understand U.S. or Western innovative nations. That's different than saying that what they're doing technologically is insignificant. That's not true, right? And we all agree with that. So Huawei is a perfect example. So Huawei may not be the most innovative company that the world has ever known, right? But it put out of business because of all the subsidies and dominant market share. It put out of business most other telecom equipment manufacturers. I think sometimes we confuse the debate, and I try to get into this in the book, between who is at the cutting edge, of most technologies. And I think, as Matt said, it's usually the U.S. and the West. In semiconductors, let's say it's the U.S., Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, a couple of European countries. And then what China can do in terms of because of its scale, the scale of its subsidies, in terms of distorting markets and grabbing market share, And by the way, another example of that would be in batteries for electric vehicles, which I think is going to be a huge issue for the Biden administration coming up. So, for example, it's not that it's battery companies are the most innovative. They're not. If you had a one-to-one competition on a level playing field, I think you'd find pretty good competition throughout the world. It's the same strategy of IP theft, of mass subsidization, of a state-led effort to create a national champion that is having effects on others' innovation and on others' market share. And I think the distinction is very important there. So they're causing us a lot of problems without catching up technologically, and perhaps even more so in the military domains. So what would I like, people in the Biden administration are taking a fresh look to look at in terms of the book. I mean, I think from a policymaker's perspective, without a lot of time and kind of spending your intellectual capital down, I'd say this is not a call to stop competing and stop deterring. This is a call to compete even more effectively with China and be able to, as Matt alluded to, take advantage of asymmetries, of vulnerabilities, of not easing up any type of pressure on China from doing the things we need to do to deter conflict, obviously, and compete militarily, but importantly, compete in the ideological realm. So my take in the book, even though it's not that prescriptive, is every dollar that China, has a massive scale, so things can look overwhelming from a U.S. policymaker perspective or from a European policymaker perspective, but it also has finite resources, right? So every let's say dollar or renminbi spent on internal surveillance or some other Praetorian Guard to protect Xi and his family is a dollar not going to something that's more aggressive and something that's more provocative and dangerous for us. And we need to continuously force those choices in China about where to spend those resources. So scarce as well. I would also say something that Matt said is extremely important. So we talk a lot about our vulnerability to supply chains, which we have, and the Trump administration and the Biden administration seems to be continuing this, wants to diversify key parts of the supply chain, particularly supply chains where China is dominant in it has a chokehold on certain critical areas of the supply chain. But China has a lot of vulnerabilities in its supply chain, a lot, and we don't look at that enough. And what I want to change the conversation to in terms of policy making, and I'll just give you another example of a Chinese vulnerability we just take no look at. China cannot anymore produce enough food for its people. It has to import food. Anything that is water intensive, it has to import because of the way it's mismanaged its land. It has huge vulnerabilities, and it writes about them in Chinese to things like agribusiness, agritech. And what I would like to see us do, I mean, obviously we're waking up to the threat and we have to take defensive measures, but is to become a bit more offensive and proactive. So there is no reason why we couldn't make China much more nervous about its global supply chain and its single source of failure in certain areas. And that's the sort of thing where I think we need to do the defense, but we need to make China start reacting to our moves and China spending money where it wouldn't otherwise, and do a better analysis of what it views as weaknesses and what it talks about as weaknesses, and move policy into that realm.
Thanks, Dan. Matt, do you want to comment a little bit on that and maybe sort of give your assessment of, I know that you were key in developing kind of the range of policy instruments, both on the, what I call the defensive side, as well as the kind of proactive side. And, if you were just generally, were they balanced, imbalanced? You wish looking forward, where do you think the Biden administration should go on these points, to Dan's point about these asymmetries and taking better advantage of them?
Well, Dan's absolutely right that we should be looking constantly for ways to seize the initiative There were times when we certainly did that in the Trump administration. I think that the tariff war, people forget that began as an investigation by the U.S. trade representative into the ways that China was obtaining, really stealing our intellectual property through forced technology transfer and cyber theft and other things. And so China was quite complacent. I think the Chinese leadership thought that given their interaction with the previous 3 or 4 administrations, that there was no way that the United States was actually going to impose serious costs on China, because those costs also carry repercussions for U.S. business. And they said that China's view was, we've already got the American business community in our pocket. There's no way they're going to pull the trigger on this. I think they were stunned when we did. And those tariffs remain in place. The U.S. has actually adapted to them quite well, as one would expect of our system. That we, there was pain inherent in that, but that people understood why we had to accept a little bit of pain in order to exert real consequences and costs on Beijing. I think that actions like the closing of their consulate in Houston, which had been involved in all sorts of malign activities, also came as a real shock to them. I saw that the Assistant Attorney General made a comment the other day that it actually led China to proactively withdraw about 1,000 undercover PLA researchers who were working in our research labs around the country. So again, Dan is exactly right. The vulnerabilities are significant. We have to be thinking both proactive steps that we need to take. We need to actually accept risk in the relationship. People, time and again, U.S. diplomats and leaders have prioritized smooth relations over U.S. interests. You have to reverse that, as I think we did. You put U.S. interests first, and you accept a friction and turbulence in a bilateral relationship, so that hopefully over time, you actually do end up with a more stable relationship, because there's more acceptance on Beijing's side that they're going to incur costs whenever they challenge American interests.
So before we turn, I see a lot of questions coming in, so maybe we'll turn to some of them a little bit earlier. I'd like you to both to comment on, related to this need to continue to advance U.S. interests and protect those interests, and the challenges of escalation, right? So more and more you see a lot of China scholars, people watching the field, concerned about the possibility of escalation and conflict. So maybe you could both comment on that sort of tough question, and then we can turn to the audience. So Dan, what is your answer to critics who say, we need to be careful, these are escalatory actions and this could lead to conflict?
Well, I think that sometimes that doesn't really demonstrate a great understanding of China, right? So over the last few years, when more risks were taken, and China for the first time was challenged on everything from internal influence campaigns inside the United States, espionage, the malfeasance of a company like Huawei, in which, by the way, I think for viewers, the other thing that Chinese are so worried about in the campaign vis-a-vis Huawei, and another big tool that we have in our arsenal, is people forget that these are cases in court, right? Now, these are criminal and civil proceedings that led to the entities list because of violations. I mean, I'm not telling you guys anything you don't know, but people forget that this wasn't just made up of whole cloth. The Huawei was taken to court for violations of U.S. law, and I would guess that as a weapon in the contest against China, if we used more lawfare, we could probably find 10 more Chinese state-owned enterprises who have violated a host of U.S. laws and could be put under indictment and therefore be considered prize. And that's something that the Chinese are fighting. People aren't writing about this anymore, are fighting these cases in court with everything they have. So anyway, that doesn't answer your questions about escalation. I think what we're doing right now, if we continue to do it, is starting to answer China's very aggressive behavior to rebalance things, if you will. So when for the last 20 years, 21 years, or maybe the last 17 years, we've saw China take one escalatory step after the other, whether it was banning scholars and media from the United States from coming into China, whether it was influence campaigns, whether it was forced technology transfer, or it was the daily in and out coercion of Taiwan through military means and cyber warfare. This didn't start in 2017. Whether it was the slow squeeze on people forget that before Xinjiang was the destruction of Tibetan culture. So they already got away with that, and they had the Olympics. There was a debate in 2008 over the Olympics, even though there was cultural genocide, maybe not by the same definition in some of these other places. So I think when it comes to human rights abuses, when it comes to diplomatic aggression, when it comes to economic malfeasance, when it comes to day in, day out military coercion, if you recall 2008, 2009 were high watermarks. And when I was at the Department of Defense in the early parts of the 21st century, they were already impeding U.S. military traffic in the South China Sea and around China. So this has been going on for a long time. So I take with a grain of salt people who say that are reacting, are starting to just defend ourselves, or maybe even reciprocate some of these actions is escalatory. I don't see that. And I don't think China sees that, frankly. As Matt says, they see it as finally a U.S. government saying, stop it for the first time.
Mm-hmm. Great point, Dan. Matt, why don't you respond, and then we'll go to questions.
Yeah, no, I agree with Dan. I mean, that's why we put this concept of reciprocity. President Trump used to say it's his favorite word, but that was the operative concept at the heart of our approach. It was saying, look, we're not going to just turn the other cheek when you're doing severe damage to our national security interests and to our prosperity. We're going to reciprocate, and sometimes it'll be in ways that are asymmetric. But we're a free and open society. We're a rule of law society. We don't take hostages, for example, the way that China routinely does. Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who are Canadians being held hostage. There are several Americans who are held hostage right now in China under what China euphemistically calls exit visa bans or exit bans, not letting people leave China. So we take other approaches that are consistent with our values and our system of laws, but we take action. And Dan mentioned lawfare. I haven't seen it written about very much, but actually, if you read the bill of indictments against Huawei, it includes indictment under the RICO statute. In other words, the Department of Justice views that company as a criminal enterprise, and it's prosecuting it as though it were a criminal enterprise. But Dan's right about escalation, right? Actually, it's really the tenet that you wrote into our national security strategy: peace through strength, Nadia. That actually gives us a chance at maintaining peace by standing up for our interests. We didn't really see significant escalation over the course of 2020 by China against us at a time when we took something on the order of 200 different steps to counteract or impose costs on activities that China had been taking against us over the years. So we had a flurry of activity, and yet the responses by China were generally fairly measured. And I think that's because they understand that they have way more to lose than we do in the economic relationship. They know that better than anyone else. It's only Americans who kid themselves that we're somehow dependent upon China generally. We are dependent on a alarming number of key components and technologies. That's why you have a government. You figure out strategies to ensure that we have a much more resilient supply chain. So do our allies. So do other countries that play by something more approximating free market principles. We can do that. We've done it before. We should be doing that. But if we do that, China's really run out of cards to play. If you look at the policy that they're pushing right now, it is explicitly to prevent a diversification of foreign supply chains from China. In other words, they want all countries to be dependent on China, even as China becomes wholly independent of all other countries in the world, at least in the high-tech space. And they're even overt about the reason for that. They say we're going to use that for countermeasures and for deterrence. In other words, they want to use it as a political weapon in the form of leverage, economic leverage, so that they can extract political concessions by countries around the world. In fact, we can make policy to sidestep that trap. We need to do that. We need to do it quickly, but we can very much do that. And then China's run out of cards to play. They are far more dependent on us, particularly in the technology space, than we are on them.
Thanks, Matt. Now I'm going to turn to Gabe, who's going to jump back in with questions from the audience. I will say that it's important that the Reagan administration really advanced the peace through strength idea. So I'd like to take credit for it, but I can't. And in terms of answering my own question, I think in the end,
you made it a vital national interest, which right, I think it actually is. So right. It was right there where it belonged.
It is. But we had no choice, right? We had no choice but to compete more effectively because we were losing ground quickly. And so, to those who argue or are concerned about escalation, I think that that's sort of the counterpoint that I often make. So Gabe, I see at least 21 questions. I see some friends in the audience too. I can't actually see them, but I see their names. So to you.
Great, thank you so much all. And we have a lot of questions. We're not going to get to all of them, but I hope that is an incentive to boost book sales to actually go deeper. So with that, I'm going to go to Keegan Sweeney and allow you to talk. And true with everybody, if you could just introduce yourself and your affiliation, and then in particular, obviously, if you're a student or alumnus of AHS, that would be great. So,
and I do know Keegan. Hi, Keegan.
How's it going, Nadia? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I'm Keegan Sweeney. I work at the Reagan Institute. I work over for Roger Zackarin, which I know all of you guys know well. So my question is on the Chinese innovation point. So I think you guys all made a lot of really good points about why you're suspect at the idea that they're going to kind of achieve cutting edge technological research. They're not going to be necessarily creating Nobel Peace Prizes. But it's kind of my understanding that they've become really effective at bringing new technologies up to scale really, really quickly throughout their economy. I think there's some signs they've done that in the manufacturing sector. Huawei is a good example of that. So my question is, even if we're better at them at cutting edge stuff, if they're getting to scale first, doesn't that still pose problems for us?
That's a little bit like Kai-Fu Lee's argument, right? In the AI superpower book that he wrote. I'll let you guys take it, but sort of they've already achieved this level, so they don't need to innovate as much as we do. So I'll let the experts go.
We're getting a bit beyond my expertise. I try to dive into technology issues on as much as I can as a foreign policy person, but I will say, here's what I understand, right? So scale is what China really, really has, scale and ambition, right? So what I use the example of Huawei, and let me use the example of two other areas I've looked at a little bit. One is the battery industry, and the other is this vaccine competition, which let me start with that one. So on the vaccine competition, we won that coming and going. I mean, the U.S. System of federal R&D before things go to market on mRNA vaccines. I've had this all written out with a lot of help from Scott Gottlieb's team and so on, plus the profit incentive of the companies, and, is so far more advanced and efficacious than the Chinese vaccines. And at the end of the day, we'll be able to scale that and get it out quickly. But when it comes to China getting something quickly to market without clinical tests and without good data, and then get it out to the rest of the world, of course. I mean, they did that. I mean, so you can have a much less efficacious Chinese vaccine if you're somewhere in Brazil, or you can wait for a much more effective US vaccine that'll take some time to get there. To me, that's how I understand part of the competition. Let me just say batteries, because it's coming. CATL has done what Huawei did, which is it's not, from what I understand, more innovative than the Japanese or Korean battery companies. It's much bigger scale, much higher level of subsidies to put others out of business, much greater incentives for auto companies to work directly with them. So they'll cause a problem. There's no question. They'll cause a problem without having the most innovative electric vehicle sector in the world.
Matt, I don't know if you have something to add to that, or I can go to the next.
No, Dan's points were great, and Keegan's point is very good as well. It is an advantage that China has right now in terms of being able to bulldoze regulation or really any semblance of people's rights in order to build out 750,000 5G cell towers, overnight. That's something we're never going to be able to do. We wouldn't want to have the disadvantages that come with that. But we wouldn't want to sacrifice all the advantages of having a rule of law society in order to have those types of advantages. But what it means is we have to make up ground where we do have the advantage. And Dan gave a very good example with the Operation Warp Speed. There was an example of a public-private partnership where the federal government was willing to accept with taxpayer money some of the risk up front for private enterprise to start scaling manufacturing of vaccines that hadn't even yet been approved yet, so that if they were approved, they'd be ready to go and to distribute. And if they weren't approved, those companies would not go bankrupt. We would help assume the cost of that. So those are the types of things that we need to do. We've got to get a lot better at public-private partnership in terms of our strategy for dealing with Chinese state capitalism and global mercantilism. And we've done it before. We know how to do it. We have to those muscles have atrophied, and we need to do it carefully. But that's really the sorts of steps that we need to be taking. So we're taking advantage of our private sector and the innovation that still is second to none.
Great. Let's go to Scott Carpenter. Scott, please introduce yourself, and the mic is yours.
Hi, Scott. I know Scott too. Wow, 2 out of 2.
This is really great to see everybody, or most people. I'm Scott Carpenter. I'm Director of Policy for Jigsaw at Google, and would have a lot to talk about. But I'm just curious on this issue of Europe's announcement of strategic autonomy, and what you all make of that announcement, and what are the implications for democracies to continue to work together to compete with, contain China.
I don't
yeah. Go ahead, Dan. I was just going to say that if you look, Scott, it's good to hear your voice, by the way. It's great to I look forward to seeing you again when COVID conditions permit. The fact is that you are seeing a coalition of the willing, in essence, a patchwork, but a very important patchwork of different coalitions that are forming around U.S. partnerships and alliances to deal with different facets of China's challenge. So if we listen to comments like that about strategic autonomy and so forth, but if you actually look at the working level, you'll find that there has been a convergence of European and American assessments of the problem from China over the last 2 years. I'd say Europe is about 18 months behind the United States in terms of taking action, but they're moving in the same direction at the same speed. They're just behind. And there'll be tactical variations in how we respond, but there's now a general agreement that there's a need to respond. If you shift from Europe over to the Indo-Pacific region, what you find is that quietly, countries are working more closely together than ever to hedge and, in other cases, just counteract Chinese aggression. The report that you may have just read, that there's going to be a summit level meeting for the first time ever of the quadrilateral grouping, the so-called Quad of Indo-Pacific democracies, the United States, India, Japan, and Australia, that big diamond that Prime Minister Abe years ago described, it's now there. It's now actually come into being. And I can tell you that the conversations that we've been having in the Quad, going back a couple of years now, have been extremely substantive. They're generally low key, but they have a very affirmative, concrete agenda, increasingly concrete agenda that we're pursuing together, strategies together to ensure that we've got more resilient supply chains, for one thing, that we're increasingly codependent on one another and not on a malign dictatorship that is attacking one of these countries on their border, India, attacking Australia's sovereignty with a 14-point demand list, saying we're going to crush your export economy unless you submit to 14 demands to change your internal legislation, which internal legislation designed to prevent Chinese espionage and malign influence. So I think that China's our biggest partner in creating this increasingly concrete coalition of countries that are pushing back against China. China's own actions are creating that equal but opposite reaction.
I'll just quickly weigh in and be a little bit tougher on our my European friends. I'll say that I didn't see who issued the statement, but I would say overall it's inconsistent with European calls over the past few years to rebuild the international order. To do that will not require autonomy. It will require making tough choices that are aligned with US interests and values, because those are consistent with democracies and with free markets. So I think the autonomy issue is more sort of a hedging, probably influenced a lot by many in the European business community, where those relationships with China, like the EU agreement, the economic agreement, are still quite strong. So, but I think it's inconsistent with where they've been in other domains. So, over.
Great. Let me go to the next question. Emma Campbell-Moan, the microphone is yours.
Hi, thank you all for talking today. My name is Emma Campbell-Moan. I'm a PhD student at MIT. I wanted to ask about your thoughts on the dual circulation model and whether you believe that China's domestic market power, if China will be able to use that to coerce companies and to sort of almost operate as a sanctions-like basis. Basically, if it can use its market power for some type of economic statecraft. Thank you both.
I can go first. I mean, it has for many, many, many years. What China has. So in the book, when I conclude a bit on strategic competition, I say that it's much. I don't like the Cold War comparisons because this is actually much more complicated and difficult. So the Soviet Union never had the market allure that China has. So when Nadia talks about separating even within states, let's say business elites from national security policymakers because of the really big scale of the market, that's just not something we had to face with the Soviet Union. When China can try to pick off, let's go back to the European case, for example, and it gets pretty industry specific, it gets pretty technology specific. Germany obviously has huge ambitions for its electric vehicle auto industry, and is very susceptible to the allure both of the China market as well as production along the supply chain by Chinese companies. So China will continue to do this. And there is no question that I keep going back to the fact that China's biggest competitive advantage economically is scale alone. So there is no question that they use the allure of access to their market, favorable access to the market, as a tool of statecraft. I will finally say that has an impact on our politics and our culture here in the United States in very disturbing ways. So cultural icons in the National Basketball Association and so on, feel the need to toe China's line in order to keep their merchandising alive. If you just look at the numbers for national NBA merchandising and market inside the United States, you can kind of see why from a commercial perspective. Hollywood, another cultural icon, very, very rarely. I mean, I always ask audiences to go back and think of the last time they saw a Chinese villain portrayed in a Hollywood movie. This is Hollywood, which portrays everyone as a villain, just about. So, and this is about the allure of economic market access in all these various industries.
That's good. Emma, I would just add that policy, it's useful that China is so overt now, carelessly so perhaps, about this strategy that says overtly, we don't want to have we in China want zero dependence on foreign trade in high technology at some point in the future that they're trying to rush to, while simultaneously making all of those industrialized economies wholly reliant upon China, so that China can use so-called countermeasures, as they put it, which means political leverage, economic leverage to achieve political aims. The fact that the fig leaf has fallen to the ground and blown away should give us all it's given us this opportunity to prepare thoughtfully allied coalition counter strategy that does not allow China to gain this sort of economic leverage, which we now know it wants to use to undermine our sovereignty and our decision space, and ultimately our dignity. So that's my reading of it. I think that it's remarkable how overt they've been about what their aims are.
Great. So next question is Catherine Clark. Just introduce yourself and let us know who your question is addressed to.
Hi, my name is Catherine Clark. I'm an undergraduate student at ASU, and my question is more directly to Dr. Blumenthal. So you highlight the immediate danger that is posed by China to the international world order, especially given their own recognition of decline in the long term. Does that mean that you believe that if the US and the rest of the Western world is able to effectively outcompete and deter China in the short term, the shift towards a more multipolar world of different values will end and the international liberal system as we know it will be more able to endure?
Well, it's a great question. I'd love to hear from my colleagues. It's also a question that we all, I think about a lot, which is, what do we want and what would we live with, right? And I think in the short term, what we want is what my colleagues started to really work on, which is to blunt China's momentum, to start to push back, to deter aggression, to make sure that China is just not on the march towards coercing our allies and therefore undermining the international system. And of course, other things like rolling back Chinese, let's say, malign gains in international organizations that matter the most to us. Now, the big question is what do we want? What do we really want out of competing effectively? Because I don't think anyone would say that we want competition of this kind. Friendly competition among friendly nations is one thing, but a competition in the way we mean it, a strategic rivalry that has a potential for a conflict, is not something we want in perpetuity. So, I think as a general matter, a U.S.-led system of alliances and international system that favors liberal order and freedoms and so on, as much as that can be accomplished realistically is what we want. So I guess the way I usually answer this sort of question is and it was in the Indo-Pacific strategy that Matt and Nadia worked on that was recently declassified. I think what we want more than anything, I think what we would live with is particularly the Indo-Pacific, sort of a negative goal in a sense, but it's very hard to get to, which is an Indo-Pacific that's not dominated by China, that has a multitude of countries aligned with us, that countries in the region, some of whom have enormous economic potential in Southeast Asia, are able to develop freely and not under the sphere of influence of a hegemonic China.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, but it's a good question.
Great. So next we'll go to Will Paplowski. Will, please introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks, Gabe. Thanks for coming, everyone. My name is Will Paplowski. I formerly served at DHS working for the Undersecretary of Policy, and I just graduated from Holy Cross last year and brought AHS to campus there. I have a range of questions, but I'll just stick with one and like with everyone else. And I'll keep it simple. How concerned should we be about Chinese and Russian cooperation? Thank you.
Hey, Will, that's it. Thanks. And it's a very good question. There's no question that there is much closer coordination right now between China and Russia than we've seen since really the Soviet-Sino split, in the middle of the last century. You see it play out in a variety of ways. Just one example. Wall Street Journal had an exclusive story this morning, building on a theme that the German Marshall Fund, some researchers there had found, which is that China and Russia, as well as Iran, are coordinating a disinformation campaign to try to undermine confidence globally in the efficacy and safety of American vaccines, American COVID vaccines, which is a really, just a segue to that. For those who keep saying, well, we really have to cooperate with China on the pandemic. I think that's a good data point to keep in mind. They're actually putting millions of lives at risk in order to try to score political points through this disinformation campaign, which is very nefarious and dangerous. So especially in these areas of disinformation, increasingly in the military space as well, China and Iran and Russia have been doing more exercises in the Persian Gulf together. I think there are limits to how far the cooperation will go, but I don't take it lightly. I think that the real loser in that partnership between China and Russia over the medium term, of course, is going to be Russia. They are the junior partner. There's no question about that in that arrangement, and they will very much be at the mercy of Beijing. The more that they come to rely on Beijing for their prosperity and security, and as part of this sort of pseudo alliance that they're building. So I do think it's important. I think the United States has to bear that in mind. I think we need to consider ways that over the long term, I think it's very, very difficult with Vladimir Putin in charge. But over the long term, there are already all sorts of signs of long-standing mistrust in both directions between China and Russia, particularly when it comes to the Russian bureaucracy. I think that they don't have a natural affinity for working closely with China, because ultimately they're going to be at the wrong end of the same kind of coercive leverage that China is attempting to apply against democracies around the world.
I would just add, I agree with Matt. I think sometimes that argument is used as a critique of kind of an ongoing of the U.S. competition with China, the tougher stance in that domain. The critics often say, well, you're just driving Russia and China closer together. Again, that's not enough of a reason to stop, I think, the trajectory of U.S. policy toward China. It's not enough of a reason. It just means it presents different challenges and different sets of policy options to deal with that side effect.
I would just add quickly, we should worry. We always have as a nation. The enduring, the sort of one fundamental enduring national interest that everybody seems to agree upon is that neither side of Eurasia can be dominated by a hostile hegemon, and that is, not Europe and not Asia. And people may say it in different ways, or a coalition of one. But as Nadia and Matt are pointing out, so if we had sort of a Dean Acheson or George Marshall or some high, someone who can really conduct the highest levels of diplomacy, you'd say, well, as alluded to, Russia would be the natural country you'd want to try to split off, or at least cause more fissures with. But with Putin involved, very, very difficult. I think the one thing I would point to, I say in the book, I talk about their cooperation in places like the Arctic, so there's a big oil and gas component to the cooperation. China wants to diversify off of Middle Eastern oil, and Russia needs someone to sell to. And then the Arctic, routes and so on. So I have a little bit of that in my book. I think the Trump administration started to create some fissures on strategic arms, or tried on strategic arms limitation. And for those interested in this subject, pay attention to how the SALT negotiations and other negotiations go. I think the Biden people made a mistake in not trying to create more fissures between China and Russia to keep the pressure on. So I think for now, what we have to do is just try to find those places where we can create fissures without expecting too much.
So I think we have time for a final question, and then maybe Dan, Matt, and Nadia, if you have some concluding thoughts to add to that question. So Wilson, Shirley, the microphone is yours, and introduce yourself, and please just specify to whom the question is addressed.
Great, thanks, Gabe, and thanks for the discussion, everyone. So Dan, in the book, you describe China as an empire pretending to be a nation state run by a Marxist-Leninist regime that is now openly exporting its ideology. But you also say it's no longer a communist revolutionary party. So how should we understand the sources of China's conduct, and what's the role of ideology?
Yeah, God, I said all that in such a short book. Yeah, so I call it a Leninist empire. It's an empire. I mean, that's what, one of the things that I think the reason I even get into history in the book is to say, look, this is an empire. There's no dispute. I mean, if you take the map of the height of the Qing dynasty and you take the map of the People's Republic of China, it's the only country in the world that looks almost the same as it did at the height of its imperium. And when it starts to claim Taiwan and Hong Kong, that's imperial. These are imperial claims. Were conquests. It would be like Turkey. I mean, I guess Turkey does this, but it would be like Turkey actually ruling over the old Ottoman Empire, right now. So last remaining empire in the world, Leninist in the sense that that's the way the government operates, dual function state and a party bureaucracy. And then the ideological component. Yeah, so this is where Nadia started off with what I see as the hardest weaknesses to measure, which are political legitimacy, political fractures. So you're trying to tell your people you're the Communist Party and be up for more purges and campaigns. And so you have all the sort of scaffolding and so on of the old Maoism, but you have no content to it, right? And so that's why I also say, so you're sort of exporting a way of governing, Leninism, and you're exporting a way that you want the world to work, to be comfortable for that form of Leninism. But then people inside get very cynical because there's no sort of belief in communist precepts or Marxism anymore. So that's how I would understand it. And I think it's a great question because it points to both the strengths and weaknesses of the China model.
And we have a couple of minutes left, so I don't know if Matt or Nadia and then Dan, any concluding thoughts on Dan's book, or maybe what's the best way we can get people to buy more copies? Maybe is the best way to conclude with these things.
Well, it's a great book, and I think that there was a great question as well, just about the role of ideology. Maybe I'll just leave you with one thought, which is that the American intellectuals and really business lobby have long resisted the idea of casting our relationship with China in any kind of an ideological framework. We were hoping that we had moved past, with the end of the Cold War, the need to keep ideology front and center in global relations, and particularly with China, which we hope was going to converge with a more liberal order. But I think if you look at President Biden's interim guidance, he put out interim strategic guidance the other day, it makes clear that the competition with China is ideological. He in his strategy document put it in rather stark ideological terms. He said that it's basically a contest between democracy and authoritarianism, and that the United States, it's incumbent upon the U.S. to prove that democracy is not a relic of history, and to show that autocracy is not the way that you achieve good governance and security in the world. And so that's really the way that China's leadership has been describing the competition with us in their internal speeches for many, many years. It's just that we either ignore what they say in their own language, or we've just been wishful. But in a sense, what you've now seen is the United States catching up to the reality that in China's mind, and in the mind of its current leader in particular, we are very much in an ideological struggle in which, in their words, one system is going to prevail over the other.
Well, I agree with Matt. I would just close by saying, I've learned a lot from Matt and Dan over the years. Areas that I'm interested in thinking about, going forward, are those differences in terms of what the CCP is saying internally versus externally, right? And Dan and Matt have taught me a lot about that, and that's really important to keep in mind. I think second, reading Dan's book also, sort of the idea of who's really driving the decoupling, right? I think it's often was the past 4 years was, oh, this is a Trump administration drive toward decoupling. I think it's actually the flip side. It's China, for many reasons, it's been driving a decoupling, and thinking about that. And then third, going forward in the context of this discussion, Scott's question about, the Europeans and strategic autonomy, really understanding what did they mean by that, right? Hide my interpretation, but kind of going back and understanding what that really means, and is it representative of where Europe is going, or is it just a kind of more of an outlier view? So I'll leave this audience of students with ideas for future papers.
That's a great way to leave it. I'd like to do the same thing. So, Matt always gets these quotes perfect, but I think Mark Twain said, if I had more time, I'd write a shorter book. I had a lot of time, and so I wrote a short book. And so that's one reason to read it. But I think what I got the most out of the process was I had this opportunity to teach the history of Chinese grand strategy for the Hertog Foundation, and I think if you're interested in China studies, I think everything that's happened has happened in Chinese history, and so everything that's happened in terms of the debates we're having, is decay more dangerous than strength, has been debated in China in the Qing Dynasty, in Mao. So I could, and so that's one thing to really focus on. And then it's just Chinese strategic history, if you can, to learn about what they're doing today. And then the second thing I would say about is what Nadia said, which is the most important question to my mind, and what drove the book in a lot of ways, is I know what we think about things. What do they think? Right? No matter what, I ask people that all the time. So this is what we think about semiconductors. Matt sort of gave a good assessment of what they think about semiconductors. I mean, it's in America, we're so big and dominant that it's really easy to get solipsistic and say, this is a problem because we say so, but do they say so? So those are the two things I'd leave for students in terms of becoming really good China hands, which I hope you do.
Nadia, Matt, Dan, thank you so much for a great conversation. Dan, I hope the book sells out again. I was only able to get a paperback copy because the hard copy sold out, which is a good sign. So Nadia got ahead of the game with me. So thank you guys all so much. Thank you to everybody for joining us, and to our students in particular. I hope you guys take away from this conversation. I think that these are really the important questions to ask. And to really go deeper into the material, and hopefully invite some of the folks in this event, frankly, to campus to talk about it more. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Nadia.
Thanks, everyone.
Especially to warm places, warm campuses. Bye.
Yeah.